My name is Scott Peterson, CEO of the National Governors Association, and I'm really thrilled. One of the things we try to do is respond to governors' suggestions, and one of the things they said is, let's try something like TED Talks. So I'm just thrilled to introduce the first governor to oversee this experiment here at the National Governors Association, Governor Doug Ducey of Arizona. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott, and I want to welcome everyone here today, and if people want to come in and grab their seat, we can get started straight away. I want to say that this is a real pleasure for me to be back in Washington, D.C. This is my third winter meeting as a governor, and I'm honored to be able to have the opportunity to kick off this Hot Topics session today. I want to thank my colleagues from around the country who are finding their way back to the table here for joining me this morning. This session is going to consist of 4 TED-like talks and presentations. We're going to be covering everything from civic engagement to the National Infrastructure Bank to state successes and artificial intelligence in the labor market. These are pressing issues for all the governors and all the states, and as citizens, as Republicans, as Democrats, these are issues we need to pay close attention to in 2017 if we aren't already. The presentations are designed to introduce information in a unique way, provide food for thought, and give ideas that we can take home and add value in our own states, all with a forward focus on the future. I'm going to kick it off, and I've got the privilege this morning to talk about the importance of civics education in our country. There's a saying among governors that you always remember your first bill that you sign into law. For me, it was the American Civics Act. It was the first law we signed in Arizona, and we were the first in the nation to do it. It's something we're proud of. It fulfilled a campaign promise, and that's something that people in this room are very good at. It also satisfied a really urgent need in our educational system. How many things do you have in front of you in this divisive political environment that can pass with bipartisan, popular, and wide support? The American Civics Act is one of those things. And it will ensure that all of our students graduate from high school with a basic understanding of our nation's history and guiding principles. Arizona's own Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman to serve on the United States Supreme Court, called this a quiet crisis in education, and it's something I felt compelled to address. Today, 15 states, red and blue, have passed similar measures. And we may be looking at 16 very soon. Because Governor Asa Hutchinson, as you know, just last week, the Arkansas House passed their version of the Civics Act by a landslide 81-4 vote. We're excited now that the bill is on its way to the Senate and encouraged that it will reach the governor's desk for signature very soon. Now I want to ask you to direct your eyes to the screen so I can show you a short video highlighting our efforts and hopefully encourage all of you to bring this idea back to your own state.
The educated citizen knows how much more there is to know. Only an educated and informed people will be a free people.
Let's start with some basics. More attention to American history and a greater emphasis on civic wisdom. If we forget what we did, we won't know who we are.
The ignorance of one voter in a democracy impairs the security of all.
It's clear that the future of our country depends on active and engaged citizens. But today, many Americans can't even name one branch of our federal government. Without a general knowledge of civics, people are deprived of the opportunity to affect positive change in their communities. Their opinions and ideas matter, and our country loses out when they go unheard.
The Civics Education Initiative is an effort to ensure that all 50 states have a graduation requirement that students must pass the same civics test that all new Americans take.
This 100-question test provides schools maximum flexibility to implement it in a way that works best for them. Unlike standardized tests, student performance cannot negatively impact schools' funding, teacher salaries, or job security. This common-sense legislation has been passed and proposed in states across our nation.
I'm proud that Arizona was the first state in the country to require a civics test. In fact, it was the very first bill I signed as governor. This important initiative is a first step towards a more engaged and civically minded youth.
As educators, we prepare students for life. By putting civics on a statewide assessment, we are showing our students that knowing how government functions is as important as math, science, or English.
So many people aren't aware, let alone engage in the issues, because they don't understand basic civics. Our generation needs to understand the structure of our government.
This initiative was so easy to implement because the teachers and study materials were already in place. This is not like other tests that require major funding and resources from the state. The test is free, the study materials are free, and it is easily accessible online.
To become a citizen, I had to pass a civics test. When I became a citizen, I was very emotional. It was something that I had desired for a long time. And it did not come easy. It took a lot of time and a lot of sacrifice. But it felt like this country was finally my home.
How can we expect new Americans to know this information and not our grade school and high school kids upon graduation from an American public high school?
From my experience, when my students know that something is on a test, they pay attention. This is the first step to help our students to have a basic understanding of civics.
If you're going to be involved in the community, you need to understand the levers of power and how you can move things forward. It's a great way for our schools to produce more active, engaged, and knowledgeable citizens. This is the kind of legislation we can all get behind.
Protect our nation's future by creating active, engaged citizens, by ensuring America's high school students understand how the government works. Let's pass the Civics Education Initiative in every state.
I want to give a big thanks to everyone that was involved in that video and for helping us spread the word on this great idea. And I especially want to thank Governor Jay Nixon, the former governor of Missouri. I think it is a testament to the strength of this organization. When I came in as a new governor, there was a class for new governors, and it was Governor Nixon from Missouri that was one of the instructors. And I called him up and asked him to be the co-chair and champion on this national bipartisan effort, and he was an easy yes, so I'm grateful for that. And while I'm on the subject of recognizing leadership, I also want to express my gratitude to Norm McClellan and Foster Freeze for their commitment to this program, and they are both with us today. It's because of their generous philanthropy and dedication to this issue that has raised this discussion from the state level to now a national level. So thank you very much. And as I mentioned before, in this political environment, civic engagement is a bipartisan issue. And I'm proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with the individuals who bring action to this vital cause. Now, as some of you know, I don't come from a traditional political background. 10 years ago, I was running an ice cream company called Cold Stone Creamery. And let me tell you, you get a lot of undeserved popularity when you're selling ice cream. I want to assure you that that all goes away when you balance your first budget. And it wasn't until I sold Cold Stone in 2007 that I first got involved in elective politics. That's when I really started to pay more attention to what was happening in government, and I wasn't happy with the direction that things were headed. I decided I wanted to do something about it, and public office seemed like a good place to get started. In 2010, I ran for state treasurer in Arizona. But as I started my campaign, I realized I was spending an inordinate amount of time to have to explain to business leaders in the state of Arizona that the office of state treasurer was an elected office. I even had one business leader that many people would recognize his name in the state of Arizona who said, "Oh, you don't have to run for that office. I can get you appointed to it." You know, that just wasn't factual. I want you to think back on your own years campaigning, and I'm sure you had to explain basic principles of governing and civics to voters in your state. So 4 years later, when I was elected governor of Arizona, I made the American Civics Act an important part of my education platform. And it's just as we saw in the video, this idea is simple. All graduating seniors must be able to pass the same test required of a new United States citizen. This is common sense, and I think it's more crucial and important to healthy political debate than ever. It was John Adams who once said, "All children should be educated and instructed in the principles of freedom." And I think that's something we can all agree on. How can we expect our children to protect the principles on which this country was founded if they don't even know what those principles are? We talk a lot about how important it is to vote, to be a good citizen, to get involved in public service. We tell young people it's your civic duty, it's your responsibility. And yet, after every election, we are disheartened by low youth voter turnout. We expect them to do their part, but I would challenge all the governors here, have we all done our part? That's why this past election, we saw that only 59% of eligible voters actually cast a ballot. Meanwhile, as Governor Nixon mentioned in the video, numerous studies and surveys show that a majority of Americans lack the basic understanding of how our country was founded, how it's governed, and what it means, and what the responsibilities are of a citizen. The statistics are alarming. According to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, only 9% of fourth graders can identify a picture of Abraham Lincoln and tell us two things he did that were important. Just 7% of eighth graders could correctly identify the three branches of government. And overall, only 24% of high school seniors scored proficient or above on the NAEP civics test. In general, interest and proficiency in basic traditional civics is declining. In a December 2014 survey, only 37% of adults said it was important to be informed about public issues, down from 56% in 1984. The picture is even more grim for young citizens. The voting rate of the millennial age group dropped from 51% in 1964 to 38% in 2012. And more recently, only 16% of this age group said that they trust government. When people do not understand the system by which they are governed, including how they affect change in that system, they are naturally going to be frustrated, and too often this leads to them disengaging from the political process. The American Civics Act addresses this, and it begins with all of us in this room. This is something we can touch all of our high school students with across the country. Because as I like to say, it's cute when a 5-year-old doesn't know who the President of the United States is. But when 10% of our college graduates believe that Judge Judy sits on the Supreme Court, it's just not that funny. So let me give you a feel for what some of the questions are on the American Civics Test. What country did we fight in the Revolutionary War? When was the Declaration of Independence adopted? Who makes the laws in the United States? And what are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution called? These are not difficult questions. And these are questions that every student should be able to answer before graduating high school. I think when we were growing up, we don't even remember where or when we were taught these things. They were with our coaches and our scoutmasters and our teachers and in our neighborhoods. But today, unfortunately, the statistics tell the story. Too many of our kids do not know the answers to these questions. But it's not all bad news, because like any national crisis, we have some wonderful people that have stepped up and organizations all over this country to find a solution. And one of those organizations is the Joe Foss Institute. And I really got this idea at a Joe Foss Institute dinner. They had Richard Dreyfuss speaking at this dinner and Charles Krauthammer, one representing the right, one representing the left. They said they disagreed on every issue under the sun. But the only issue that they had 100% agreement on was the American Civics Act. And it was the way that they had a healthy, respectful, and civil debate on the direction they wanted to see the country go. Like I said, there aren't many issues that as a governor, and when I was running for office, I adopted this the next day, would get spontaneous applause when I said we were going to bring this back to American high schools. And the Joe Foss Institute had a model bill. So I want to take a brief moment to briefly recognize one of the biggest champions of this effort, my friend, Dr. Lucian Spataro. Now, Lucian had planned on being here this morning, but sadly, a death in his family has rerouted him back to Ohio to be with loved ones during this difficult time. Our condolences and prayers are with the Spataro family. And while we're looking forward to hearing from Lucian today, I'm excited that Karen Summers is here to speak for him and on his behalf for the Joe Foss Institute. So will everyone join me in giving a very warm welcome to the stage to the Vice President and Director of Communications of JFI, Karen Summers. Thanks, Karen.
Good morning. Thank you, Governor. I'm honored to be here on behalf of Dr. Spataro and the Joe Foss Institute. And I really want to begin by thanking you personally for all your efforts and your vital role. You identified a problem and you took action. That's effective leadership and great governance. Today, the Civics Initiative has grown into a national effort with strong bipartisan support, and I am proud to say it all started in Arizona. However, I think you all can sense the magnitude of this endeavor. It's a significant step forward, and yes, it's a big lift. With this in mind, I'd like to talk to you about our involvement in this initiative, why we're going with it, and why you should care and how you can help. First, let me tell you about JFI, the enduring legacy of Joe Foss, a Medal of Honor recipient and former governor of South Dakota who founded the Institute in 2001. JFI has served nearly 2 million students through its Veterans Inspiring Patriotism program, which works with vets to deliver educational materials, including the U.S. flag and founding documents, in classrooms all over our country, in all 50 states. Through this endeavor, though, we were able to see firsthand how the emphasis in the classrooms has shifted away from civics, creating, as Governor Ducey said, the education crisis that we find ourselves in today. So in 2014, JFI launched the Civics Initiative, and now, as you can see on the map, 15 states have enacted our proposal, and 20 more states are considering the legislation this year. By the end of 17, we hope to have passed the legislation in over half the country. States who've adopted this requirement are already engaging students and showing transformative changes. For example, in Jamestown, North Dakota, not one freshman passed the pretest given on the first day of class last year. And in fact, most of the scores were under 45%. However, by the end of the semester, 95% of the students not only passed the test, they scored over 70%. In terms of the model of the test and how it's given, we know that there is no one-size approach that fits all. The states are, in fact, the laboratories of democracy, and we are seeing many of them take ownership and customizing the legislation to fit their own states and needs. For example, some states have actually increased the threshold of passage to 70% from 60%. Others have, in fact, added their own state's questions, such as when was our state founded, or who is our first female legislator. Regardless of how each state implements the initiative, it's clearly a very different experience than current standardized testing models, where students are pulled out of the classroom and they spend hours coloring the bubbles on the Scantron papers and hope that you don't have to erase anything. The citizenship test, however, though, is not that. It is a very straightforward test, and it can be taken on paper, online, or even on an app. And it costs nothing. I would like to repeat that. It absolutely costs nothing. It is not tied to teacher salaries or school funding, and all it does is establish a baseline of knowledge which is absolutely necessary to understand higher topic levels. We all know that before you can read, you have to learn to spell. Before you can spell, you have to learn the alphabet. Before you can solve complex equations, you have to memorize your multiplication tables. These concepts are fundamental critical thinking to those subject areas. And we believe that the questions posed by the civics test are just as fundamental in civics. As Thomas Jefferson envisioned, it's our responsibility to pass on these civic virtues and set high expectations for our children and for future generations. And now before I turn it back over to Governor Ducey, I have a question for all of you, and I'm going to ask you to think back to your days as a student, and some of us will have to think further back than others. What was the one question that you could count on someone asking in your class every time, every lesson, without fail, and we may have even been one of those that asked that question? Is this going to be on the test? And you remember how it all went. If the answer was yes, we all took our notes. Now they get out their computers. We had pad and paper. And we engaged in the subject matter and paid attention. On the other hand, if the answer was no, the entire class leaned back, took it easy, drifted off, disengaged. Today they take out their phones, check Facebook. So from a student's perspective, having civics on a test that matters is important. It tells them the topic is important. And as it relates to America, the same is true. We want our students leaning forward and informed, and we should expect no less of ourselves. This can be a team effort. I hope you all will throw your shoulder into this and help us get it done. In a moment, you have in front of you packets that will tell you how to move the effort forward in your state. And I would encourage all of you to also stop by our civics booth, which is at the top of the escalator, and ask any questions, and we're happy to help with any resources that we can. Thank you again for your time, and Governor Ducey, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks, Kim. Great job. Thank you. Thanks, Karen. A great job, and I want to thank the Joe Foss Institute for its great work here in making it so easy for us as governors and legislature to continue this progress. You know, I'm very optimistic about what's possible here, and I think Karen gave a great example. You memorize your multiplication tables so you can move along in math. These are some questions, if you know the answers to, you can engage in more civic debate. Now, will one exam at the end of high school solve this crisis that Justice O'Connor spoke so eloquently about? It will be a good first step as a solution, and that's why I'm encouraging it. But at the very least, this is going to entice students to learn basic civics. And at the very best, it can create a lasting interest and lifelong engagement among American citizens of all ages. And if you care more about computer coding than you do civics, I want you to know that a number of students in the state of Arizona actually created an app so students could study civics on their phone. And that's been a real positive as well. And I've said several times that this is a bipartisan issue. But I know not everyone's on board yet. But that's okay. You know, Arizona was the 48th state to join the union, so we know that sometimes good things can take some time. I like the saying that the best politics are good policy. So consider this. According to a poll of 804 likely voters nationwide, 74% would support a bill making a civics test a requirement of graduation. 59% said they were more likely to support you, their elected officials, if you supported a proposal like this. So factor that into your thinking. You and I are chief executives of our states, and this is one of the most important things we can do, is to make sure that when we eventually pass the torch, we can say we did our part to leave the youth of our state better and stronger and smarter than we found them. So please help us put civics on a test that matters so that when our children become citizens and leaders and stand at the same podium you stand at back home, they would make our framers proud. I want to thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to working with all of you and answering any questions that you have in this vital pursuit. And I once again want to thank Karen Summers for her help with this project. So next up, we have Leo Hindery. He's the managing partner of Intermedia Partners, who will lead a discussion on a hot topic of our nation's infrastructure. Hindery is an accomplished television executive holding a former role as the founding chairman and CEO of the Yes Network, the regional television network for the New York Yankees. During his tenure there, he won 5 executive producer Emmys for outstanding programming. Additionally, he's been recognized in the past as International Cable Executive of the Year, Cable Television Operator of the Year, one of Business Week's top 25 executives of the year, and one of the cable industry's 25 most influential executives over the past 25 years. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome to the stage Leo Hindery.
Thank you, Governor. A real pleasure. Thank you all very much. A real privilege to be with you today. The issue of infrastructure is first and foremost the issue of the governors. It is not the issue of our Congress. They will enable it. It is not the issue of our administration, but rather they will only approve it. It is first and foremost a part and parcel of your stewardship. You know firsthand, better than anyone, that infrastructure in the United States has fallen far behind, whether in real dollars or current dollars, with the greatest needs being in surface transportation projects, in electricity transportation transmission projects, in broadband, an area close to my heart, in airports and wastewater projects. These are at the lowest levels since records have been kept. Figures that now have become indisputable is that the shortfall of projects is on the order of $3.3 trillion over just the next decade. Fairly indisputably, about half of that number seems to be outside of the abilities of our states and our municipalities. So about $1.5 trillion is clearly, we believe, outside the capabilities of your state and your municipal budgets. Yet we know firsthand, those of us throughout this country, that infrastructure investment, more than anything else, is perfectly poised to take advantage of the growth sectors of our economy, whether they be in energy, in driverless vehicles, clean tech, all of which are just now starting to wash over all of our manufacturing initiatives. And especially notable is despite the fact that a nationwide decade-long program of infrastructure investment with its massive multiplier effects throughout the whole of our economy is the best positioned of all the things we might consider in Congress and elsewhere to close the persistent real unemployment gap in this country and in your states. We've been at this now for almost a decade, and there seem to be only 3 meaningful funding alternatives available to the administration and to Congress. We're all accustomed to smallish block grants otherwise authorized by Congress of the sort we've seen for decades. An alternative would be something called a new budgetary cap, a budgetary cap which is a defined term in our system. But this one would be devoted exclusively to investments in infrastructure, since the 2 existing budgetary caps, the one for defense and the one for non-defense, specifically do not provide an opportunity today for Congress to allocate funds for infrastructure. And then, as we suggest, a third alternative, which we'll discuss at length, which is a new independent national infrastructure bank. We know from the past that block grants, whether and a budgetary cap, a new one or an old one, would have to be determined in the regular appropriation bills enacted by Congress. This means it would be practically impossible to prioritize projects, as we've seen firsthand. Also, perhaps most important of all, neither block grants nor spending under a cap would leverage the available private funding sources in ways that come anywhere close to meeting the $1.5 trillion figure that we've discussed. In short, we believe after a decade of analysis and effort, bipartisan and nonpartisan alike, that only a new national infrastructure bank would address these limitations and overcome these obstacles. The particular bank we are proposing would be a wholly owned government corporation with nonpartisan directors appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. By law, the bank's investment decisions would be made in a transparent, nonpartisan manner, and in order to make the bank as responsive as possible to the differing needs across your 50 states, we would regionalize the bank in ways similar to what we have done already with the Federal Reserve. The bulk of the bank's capital structure, 90% of the total $1.5 trillion of total capitalization, would come from loans to the banks by the nation's large state and municipal pension plans and by certain sovereign wealth funds, such as we find in Norway. Only the remaining 10% would be appropriated by Congress in the form of shared first dollar of loss guarantees of the bank's loans to infrastructure projects. To repeat, the remaining 10%, only the remaining 10% would be appropriated by Congress in the form of shared first dollar of loss guarantees of these projects. In other words, $350 billion of the bank's capitalization would come from the large fiduciaries of our country and from fiduciaries outside our shores. The first $300 billion of losses on the bank's projects, if there are any, would be shared 50-50 between the bank and the U.S. Treasury. Importantly and obviously, it's the fiduciary plan's relatively low costs of capital, expectations of just 2 or 3% on their fixed income portfolios, which match up best with the objective of achieving for the bank the lowest possible cost of capital, which unfortunately has seldom been the case with P3s, as productive as they have been. And of course, the plans themselves are induced to invest in the bank by the support available to them from the shared federal guarantees. It's especially important to note because this is the obstacle that most confronts us, that because the financial default rate of public investment infrastructure projects is de minimis on the order of just 1% or less, OMB should, we believe, after many conversations and discussions, OMB should, based on both precedent and on the very low risk profile of the shared federal guarantees, score for Congress only the cost of any actual drawn down federal guarantee payments, and then only if and when these support payments are made. In essence, the actual amounts ultimately scored by OMB for federal budget purposes will be much, much less than the $150 billion figure, and that will only occur as and if losses occur. The major reason that guarantees score so little is that lenders and ultimately borrowers in this category typically pay a guarantee fee that is set over time to cover anticipated costs of default. And since well-run credit programs of the sort we're discussing often run at zero subsidy, this should mean, in the specific case of our National Infrastructure Bank, little or zero actual cost to America's taxpayers. As an aside, I would contrast this with the promises and the aspirations we heard throughout the 2016 campaigns. $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there, $250 billion here or there, none of which, with all respect, is possible under our constraints in Congress. Well-meaning and well-intentioned women and men who govern this country have often seen, with all respect, eyes bigger than their stomachs in this category. It's inconceivable to those of us who do this closely that any more than tens of billions of dollars would be possible through this Congress, no matter how the merits of the projects come out. 10 years ago this month, we started out with the 4 nonpartisan, bipartisan objectives of one, first, best financing the more than $1 trillion of needed but unsupported infrastructure projects while minimizing the federal government's contribution. We had an objective of best and most fairly prioritizing projects given the broad array of projects out there that confront your 50 states. 3, we wanted to make sure these projects are advanced as efficiently and as creatively as possible. And 4th, we hoped that we would impactfully address the real unemployment crisis that continues to confront this country while energizing the manufacturing sector. Objectives 1 and 2 being of size and being of fairly appropriated, we believe that was all taken care of by the bank. Regarding project approval and employment, we believe that since the current federal, state, local approval architecture is not at all conducive to the timely approval of major infrastructure projects, that the enabling infrastructure bank legislation should also reconstitute the project approval process so that projects are shuttled through in no more than a year, and we believe that the White House should be granted authority to appoint one agency as a one-stop shop in the case of interstate projects. We believe that environmental review should be coordinated through a single designated federal agency with reasonable limitations on the extent and on the subject matters of such reviews, and we believe that commencement of litigation should be in the first 90 days or not at all. Finally, regarding employment, we believe that consistent with our various trade agreements, all infrastructure projects approved by the bank should require that major associated purchases be made in America with at least 90% of the content having to be actually manufactured within America's borders. And at the same time, we believe, consistent with your goals of ensuring good jobs for America's workers, that infrastructure projects should require that all associated work, whether by contractors, constructors, or suppliers, should be covered by prevailing wage laws and by Davis-Bacon and its related project agreements. Scott and his colleagues have asked that we share these comments with all of you, and in a mechanism I'm not yet familiar with. They'll be available to you, the whole speech. But let me close by looking back a bit to countless administrations since the Eisenhower administration, where an infrastructure need that's measured at that time in hundreds of billions of dollars, which now exceeds $3 trillion, has been met for the most part only with block grants that address the smallest of fractions of those needs. With all respect to Congress, we cannot begin to address the $1.5 trillion of projects that you need that are validated in all 50 of your states in a way that relies on Congress for appropriations. With all the good graces of the new administration, they have already identified, we understand, 51 projects throughout the country, some in your states, some not in some of your states, aggregating $226 billion of expenditure. These are thought to be by the new administration shovel-ready projects, and they're good ones. However, they leave out a number of your states, and that figure of $226 billion is so far beyond the ken and beyond the capability of Congress in the appropriations process as to cause us great alarm. But even if Congress were to approve $226 billion of infrastructure projects, that would be less than a fifth of the projects you've identified for your states, which your citizens need. So in closing, we said it needed to be big, it needed not to be scored for federal budgetary purposes, it needed to be nonpartisan, and it needed to be regionalized. And we thought that the governor of Alabama and the governor of Alaska and everybody in between needs to have equal opportunity for their projects to be approved. The schedule this morning allows for a few minutes of Q&A. We're happy to follow up with any of you on this initiative, which is being considered as we speak by the new administration and Mr. Trump, President Trump's colleagues, and by leadership in both the Senate and the House on both sides of the aisle. And again, as I said, Scott and his colleagues will make my remarks available to you in some fashion here later this morning. So thank you very much. It's a privilege. This is your issue. It was an enormous privilege of Scott and Governor McAuliffe and others of your colleagues to invite me to here this morning. And I hope this has been somewhat informative. But Scott, we do have some time for a few questions from people in the audience as well, certainly of you governors. So thank you very much.
I have a quick question for you. You had mentioned several different criteria that this was being proposed with the ideas. I think it's a fantastic idea. I think it's innovative. I think it harnesses capital that otherwise is no more better deployed in other areas to serve a need. Everything about it I understand, but I'm curious about one caveat that you mentioned right there at the end, that you felt it would be best done only at the prevailing wage. Why is that? Why could you not write code specs and hold people to those when writing bids that would really let the free market speak as to what is the most cost-effective use of that capital?
Governor, I think you could, and I think you could do it ably, and you certainly have been a leader in that initiative in the state of Kentucky. The problem is we got to get something through Congress. And in talking to the administration, this administration, they were comfortable with me putting in that phrase. But it's above my pay grade. The thing that I find so daunting is the enormity of these projects and the resultant user fees that will need to be generated. And more than the amount of the bank, as attractive as that is, because we do talk of the full $1.5 trillion that are outside your capabilities, it's the cost of capital. And well-intentioned projects throughout the United States have had implicit costs of capital of 10, 11, and 12% with immediate resultant user fee damage, in my opinion. We went and said, who could we get to like the bank at pick a number 2 to 3% return of capital? And there are fiduciaries out there who find that acceptable, provided we gave them some support. So we tried 4 different variations of what that support might look like. And we've talked to the major fiduciaries in the United States, the pension plans, and overseas. and this shared first dollar of loss, which will never materialize. So we were big, we were non-scored for federal purposes. I can, with great conviction, tell you, except for the administrative costs of the bank, we will likely never score for federal purposes this bank. And we did it in a way we thought that kept the user fees in your states and the others at acceptable levels. I would, as a digression, this project, this bank, is not supposed to fix the Oroville Dam. It's not supposed to fix the broken lock in the Mississippi. There's a levee that's under some distress in Louisiana. This is a bank for projects in electricity transmission, in air, in roads and bridges, in broadband, that you simply, with all respect, can't afford to fund.
Thank you. I appreciate the presentation here, and it does give me some pause and maybe an outside-the-box need to look. I'm still a little bit puzzled about why, if we have this need for capital, and certainly in Utah we've been building a lot of roads and freeways and buildings, but we've always been able to go to the private sector and bond and borrow the money we need there. Why is it that we need to help me understand the need for this new government run, maybe it's a public-private partnership, but what's the advantage to doing this as opposed to just going to the private sector?
Governor, it's primarily the cost of capital relative to the magnitude of the need. This $1.5 trillion, there's about, to repeat, there's about 3.3 trillion of need, roughly 1.8 trillion of which seems to be within the capabilities of your states and municipalities. It's the $1.5 trillion over and above that. We could fund that in Wall Street terms, but we would also fund it probably with a double-digit cost of capital implicit in it. So we backed up and said, where can we go to the governor's comment, where can we go first for low single-digit rates of return? And that took us to the fiduciary community. We started with the premise, Governor, that we could not get anywhere close to these figures through Congress. Well-intentioned administrations in the past typically have asked Congress for $40 to $50 billion of block grants, mostly to the DOT, and even those have struggled in recent years.
So again, let me just follow up if I could. So what we're saying, the capital's in the marketplace. Whatever it's 3 trillion, 4 trillion, the capital you're saying is in the marketplace, but for us to access this through existing banking policy, we can't get it from the federal government, but through existing banking opportunities, you're suggesting the cost is too high for us to acquire the money, and this will be a less expensive way to borrow money.
It's a factors less expensive way, Governor. It's a nonpartisan way so that the approval of projects don't fall into the morass that we sometimes encounter. And literally, of the 50 governors, it's only their project strength that's being considered, not their politics. And yeah, but it's fundamentally, Governor, the cost of capital. It's low single digit versus...
Well, I would expect the marketplace wouldn't care about the politics either. It would just look at the merits of the project and decide whether we should lend money or not.
I agree. I agree.
But you risk.
With all respect, you may hear from Congress and the administration to just do P3s against these massive numbers that are being contemplated, knowing that historically, and we can prove it, that P3s give you projects, they sometimes give you unaffordable projects.
Thank you.
A big round of applause for Leo Hindery.
Thanks,
Thank you, Leo. Thank you very much. And I know there are more questions for Leo. I saw Governor Walker had them. He's going to be here. The speech is going to be available online as well. But we have two more TED-like talks this morning, and I want to give these gentlemen the allotted time. Next up is another look at the future, and it comes from the current editor of U.S. News and World Report, Brian Kelly. So here to introduce Brian Kelly is Eric Gertler. He is the co-chairman of U.S. News and World Report and the New York Daily News. Eric?
Thank you, Governor. And Thank you, Leo, for a very important discussion. I know the perfect place for you to write an article and continue the discussion in U.S. News. And by the way, we pay the same rates as the NGA for your article. So, U.S. News has been here in Washington since the days of President Roosevelt when he was writing and enacting the New Deal. Now, we all know the most important biographical piece of information about President Roosevelt. He was a former governor. So, although our mode of distribution has changed in the 80-plus years that we've been here in Washington, from a magazine to what is primarily now a digital platform, and we service over 35 million unique users every month, our values haven't changed. We stand for credibility in journalism, and we are the authority on rankings, news analysis, and helping consumers through important life decisions. Now, some of you here may have kids thinking about college, and you probably have looked at our best colleges rankings as they think about the college process. Or some of you may have turned to our best hospitals rankings as you try and navigate through the complex healthcare system and relied on those best hospital rankings. So today, Brian Kelly is going to discuss our most recent project. Brian has been at U.S. News for 19 years, the last 10 of which he has been the editor and the chief content officer, and he has been the creative force behind the digital transformation of our company. Prior to that, he was also a senior editor at the Washington Post. Now, I can think of no one more knowledgeable and more expert in working on this, and I know there's a lot of competition in this room. So without continuing, I now turn it over to Brian Kelly to discuss our latest project, the rankings of best states. Thank you.
Eric, thank you, Eric. I didn't realize I'd been the editor for 10 years. When I started, I was the same height as Governor Baker. Kind of shrunk down here a little bit. It's been a long run, but it's been a good run. So let me start by saying, in reference to Karen Summers' nice comments, this will be on the exam. So please take notes. And the results of the exam will be published on Tuesday. Eric said we're doing a ranking, so the rankings will be out on Tuesday. But I will get into a little more detail about the rankings and more than that. Let me give you a little context of how we got here. So when I was 2 years old, my mother thought I was going to be a genius. I look around the room and I realize I'm probably in pretty good company in that regard. The reason was because I could do the jigsaw puzzle of the states. I could put all the pieces together, including Arkansas and Missouri, which are really hard when you're 2. Later, my fascination with the states extended to winning the, I believe it was the 3rd grade geography bee, because I could name all the state capitals, including Frankfurt. Governor, all due respect, I don't think anybody knows that Frankfurt's the capital of Kentucky except the governor of Kentucky. And Salem is the capital of Oregon, not Portland. But that's, I don't want to show off here, because I know I'm in good company with that. The genius thing did not work out for me, needless to say. But my fascination with the states progressed. I did pass some of those civic exams that Karen was talking about. I think I did okay on that. I became a reporter, was very fortunate to have covered national politics in many venues, a lot of them in state legislatures. So I've been in Trenton and Madison and Charleston, West Virginia, and Illinois, where I spent some great time when I was as reporter in Chicago. And I think developed a real appreciation for what goes on in the states, the complexities of the problems that you guys have to deal with, and some of the funny rituals like stopping the clock to make sure that the budget is passed within 6 months or so. That's the Georgia state legislature, I believe. Fast forward, I came to Washington. And as Eric mentioned, worked for the Washington Post in a number of national capacities. And I think one of the things that I really developed a further appreciation of was how much emphasis we the media in particular, place on Washington, and relatively how little emphasis we place on the states. And I think in the 30 years I've been in Washington, that gap has probably only grown. We see, evidence even now, as my business has changed, as the media business has changed, fewer resources. There's fewer great regional papers. Resources come out of the state houses. More and more people come to Washington, which is quite interesting these days. There's lots to write about. Much of it is not very substantial. There's a lot of hysteria, and there are a hell of a lot of people chasing that hysteria. So one of the things that we thought at U.S. News, we've always been a magazine. In the old days, Eric said 90 years old. Our sensibility, our DNA has always tried to exist between the coasts. We don't, revere New York or Los Angeles the way some of our competitors do. We've always been a magazine that sort of valued the heartland. And I think we saw an opportunity here to refocus some of the attention on our part and hopefully among our readers on the states. So what we are launching is, it is, as Eric said, it's a ranking of the states, but it's really a new website. It's really a new website called Best States, which I'll give you some more information on that in terms of what the components are there, because it's about journalism, it's about storytelling, it's about a two-way street and gaining some insights from you and from your constituents. Why U.S. News? Well, we've been doing this, as Eric said, a long time. We've been ranking colleges for 30 years, hospitals. We've become, I think, a very influential force in that space. We view this as important journalism, very powerful journalism that helps drive decisions. There are fewer mortality. The mortality rate in cardiac care has been diminished because of the U.S. News ranking, because of the transparency. We're able to have like-minded hospitals look at each other and say, why are more people dying in my emergency room than yours? That's very powerful data, very powerful journalism. And when you can marry that with the storytelling, which is a key component of this, and explain it to people and make it accessible to consumers, I think you have a very strong platform to stand on. So we feel good about that. In this project, we partnered with another group that we think is an enormous powerhouse of data, McKinsey & Company, the consulting firm that I know some of you guys work with. And they have been a terrific partner in pulling together this vast amount of data that we've put together in the rankings. We understand states matter, and we think that the components of what happens in the states, healthcare, education, obviously at the top of the list, infrastructure, which we just talked about, public safety, enormous, fundamentally the economy, how do you rate an economy, equal opportunity, a very, very important part of who is benefiting from the system, and then government efficiency. So those are sort of the 7 buckets that we looked at in great detail. And what we found was, these are the things we measured, are not just top level. We have 68 of these 7 buckets, which we think are significant components of the quality of the state. We have 68 measures within those where we're looking at things very granularly. So something like hospital readmission rates, something we're very familiar with. It's a tremendous proxy for the quality of institutions. We look at access to health care. We look at quality of coverage. Road and bridge quality, again, top of mind for everyone. One of my favorites, parole completion, right? Had to dig into that a little bit more to understand that. But that's, again, a real metric that I know you're familiar with that talks about the quality of the rehabilitation system in terms of crime and corrections. What we found, a lot of surprises. I'm not going to tell you what we found, okay? I'm promising you we will tell you on Tuesday. But we did find some very surprising things. It's not the usual suspects. A lot of states have things that they do well. Not too many states have many, many things that they do well. But, as I said, 49th ranked state is one of the best states for disability equality. Low infrastructure, say with infrastructure problems, could be number 1 in healthcare. So each of those components also becomes its own ranking. How do we look at the states just in terms of healthcare, just in terms of education? So in general, healthcare, we surveyed with McKinsey, we did a citizen survey, what matters to you? So we're not just randomly picking these numbers. Healthcare is the top of people's list. Education is number 2. So high insurance rates, those states are going to do well. High graduation rates, achievement gap between minorities and majorities. These are all key factors that roll up into what turns out to be a best state. But again, as I say, within those components, there's some very interesting things that everybody can draw on and hopefully benefit from. So this is, I say, will be a new website. It'll be produced, launch on Tuesday. It will be produced every day. It will have news. It will have profiles of states. It will have opportunities for you to interact with tourism and economic development. We see this as, we are primarily a consumer-facing company, but we have a thought leader audience. So I think we want to make it as accessible to people as we can make it. We have all kinds of charts and, using all of the, the wonderful capabilities of the internet to give people things that they can get their hands on and understand and measure. But it's also, we are very interested in hearing from you, contributions from governors, contributions from leading officials in the states, talking about what it is that you're doing. We've already had, we've interviewed, I know, at least a dozen or so governors already. Because we think, again, the point of this being a hub for this bigger conversation is really what is going to be the most, I think, the most useful thing. Why do we do this? We're in the journalism business. We're in the information business. We try to come at this as objectively as we can. We think we're pretty good at compiling the data. We're an honest broker. We're not picking sides. We don't have any ideological issues in this. But we also, we live in the United States. We have U.S. News in red, white, and blue in our logo. We do think that there is some, there's some disconnect in the marketplace of ideas and information. We think, we're also a business, so we get to fill that and maybe make a little money doing it. But it is part and parcel of our role with a public service mission and as journalists to engage in something and to fill spaces that are vacant, which we think is what we have here. Our philosophy at U.S. News and our rankings is you can't improve what you can't measure. And we think that we got a pretty good measure here that gives us a starting point. We think it's a starting point for what we hope is a broader conversation. We hope it's a conversation that we can have with you. I'm sure we will be having it with your constituents. We expect many millions of people coming and taking advantage of this information over time. But we do keep at our heart the notion that this is our mission to provide information, to provide transparency in a usable form that citizens can use to make decisions about the government that they have to live with. And we think that we've got something here that will be very exciting and really would like to hear from you when this launches on Tuesday. So appreciate your time, Scott and Tiffany, for having us here. Kind of a little unusual for media companies to be presenting, but we think we have something interesting that we can carry forward with you as time goes on. We want to, it's a cliche, I'm from Washington, I'm here to help. I realize that can be overstated, but I'm from a different part of Washington, so maybe we can help a little bit more than the other parts. So thank you very much for your time and look forward to hearing from you in the future.
Thank you, Brian. Well done. I want to thank Brian Kelly and Eric for being here. And finally, I also want to welcome Jason Furman. I was able to first see Jason about a year ago at the AEI World Forum, and I think we're in for a treat this morning. Jason is with the Peterson Institute for International Economics. His discussion is going to focus on the continued impact of automation and artificial intelligence on the economy and the labor market. I think something that's affecting all of our states. Furman joined the Peterson Institute for International Economics as a senior fellow in January of 2017. Prior to this role, he served as the top economic advisor to President Barack Obama for 8 years, including as the 28th chair of the Council of Economic Advisors from August 2013 to January 2017, acting both as Obama's chief economist and a member of the President's cabinet. Please welcome Jason Furman. Go get him.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Governor. Is this working? Yeah, it seems like it's working. So I don't have anything super practical for you in terms of a civics lesson, a ranking, or an infrastructure bank, although all three of those seemed great. At least the rankings might depend on where some of my favorite states do, but I'll reserve judgment until Tuesday. What I wanted to talk to you about was this question that I get all the time, that all of us get all the time, which is, will the robots be taking our jobs? This is a question that CNN asked in a story last year where they said smart robots could soon steal your job. It's also something, if you don't trust CNN, that the New York Times asked in 1980, where they said a robot is after your job. If you don't trust the New York Times, you also can find this in the Wall Street Journal, in this case in 1960, worried about whether the robots were going to come and take our jobs. Or you can go all the way back to 1935 and now the Washington Post talking about machines taking our jobs. Or you can even go all the way back to the year 1812. So this is a problem people have been worried about for a while. So far, the answer has been no. This is the unemployment rate over the last 115 years. It's basically always been around 5 or 6%, and when it's gone up a lot, it's not because there were a lot of robots in the 1930s, for example, and when it's gone down, it wasn't because those robots went away. And this is an amazing thing, because workers today are 9 times more productive than they were in 1901. They have a lot more machinery, a lot more equipment, stuff that for every worker does, in effect, the job of 9 other people that used to do those jobs that don't do those jobs anymore. But all that massive amount of automation that we've seen so far hasn't increased our unemployment rate because it's created new jobs we couldn't have imagined in 1900. And importantly, it's also made people richer. Their GDP per capita has gone up, they spend more, and so they spend more on everything from restaurants to travel that they weren't doing nearly as much of in the year 1900, and that's created all sorts of jobs, making us richer in material goods, and also a little bit richer in leisure, although that process has leveled off in the last couple decades. In fact, the thing that I personally am most worried about right now isn't that we're going to have so much automation and innovation that it's going to replace all the jobs, but precisely the opposite, that we've seen a big slowdown in the growth rate of labor productivity. So this is another way of thinking about automation, the amount you produce per hour. In the United States, it had been growing at about nearly 2.5% rate. Now it's growing at about a 1% rate, which is pathetic compared to what it was. It's only slightly good in comparison to everyone else. We're doing faster than Japan, Canada, Germany, France, the UK, and Italy, all of whom have seen bigger slowdowns than we have. So the first thing I'd say about artificial intelligence, about the robots, about automation, is we need more of it, and we need more of it in order to increase our growth rates. It's not, though, entirely without side effects and without challenges, and that's what I want to turn to next. Those challenges I don't think are as simple as every time you have a machine, it takes a job and unemployment goes up, but there are challenges nonetheless. If you look at estimates of the share of jobs threatened by automation, they vary really substantially. Researchers at Oxford put it at nearly half. They didn't give you the time over which that would happen, and for any of you in the prediction business, it's always good to either predict a number or a date and never to do both. They did half. At the OECD, they put the number at 9%, and part of the observation the OECD made is that a lot of this innovation replaces a specific skill, but that any given job, you need to do 5 different things, and if automation can figure out how to do 3 of those 5 things, well, it can't take that job away from you. You still need the human for the other 2. So these are the range of estimates. What I get nervous about, though, is if you look at what jobs are being threatened by automation. And this next chart is from an analysis that my colleagues and I did that looks based on what the chance a job will be replaced, looks by wage. And while there's examples of radiologists and lawyers where automation might replace those jobs, there aren't a lot of jobs when you look at $40 an hour and above that appear to be really threatened by automation. If you look at less than $20 an hour, an awful lot of them seem like they'll be able to be replaced. You see the same thing, and this is a different study, but it reaches the same conclusion, when you look at the share of jobs where the skills can be automated, and you look by education. Less than a high school degree, it's nearly half of them. With a graduate degree, it's none of them, and that's why you're listening to me speak rather than a robot. This then creates a challenge. Part of the challenge is the challenge we've seen in the last several decades with the rise of inequality. This is a lot of different ways to measure it. This is the share of income going to the top 1%. And basically, you've had automation replacing jobs at the middle and the bottom, not jobs at the top. People have kept their jobs, but they've kept it because wages have gone down at the bottom and the middle relative to the top. People at the top have had skills that have complemented automation, so they've done better. People at the middle and the bottom have been replaced by automation. That doesn't mean you necessarily lose your job, but it might mean that you get underbid by the robot and your wages go down. A second thing that concerns me and is related, is I think the same exact phenomenon, a different way of looking at it, is this is the share of prime-age men, this is between 25 and 54, who participate in the workforce. These are people in jobs or trying to find jobs. In the 1950s, it was 98%. It's fallen steadily and now is 88%. And if you look, this is mostly people with a high school degree or less. This is mostly the people whose skills have been more substituted by automation rather than complemented. And if you look at women, you see a similar trend since the year 2000. So it's not that one-for-one jobs are being replaced, but that you have a competition. Some people are thriving in that competition. Others are being left behind and potentially having a harder time finding a job or finding it at a lower wage. Ultimately, though, I don't think technology is what tells us exactly what's going to happen in our economy. It depends a lot also on the policy choices that we make in our states, the federal government, and otherwise. And one way to see that is the same decline in the participation of the workforce. If you look across the OECD economies from 1990 to 2015, it happened actually in a much bigger way here in the United States than it did in a lot of other countries. And it's not related to the degree of automation. Countries like Luxembourg have really high productivity, but haven't had this. Italy's had really bad productivity. It's also had this. It very much has depended on the types of policy choices that different countries have made. And I'll leave you with some big pictures about what I think this implies for policy. The first is we need more productivity growth. That's the only way to have faster economic growth. That's the only way to have sustained increases in wages. It's not something we should fear. It's something we should celebrate and look for opportunities to promote. The second is that job loss is not inevitable, but employment isn't automatic either. And looking at the types of programs, whether they're training, job search, apprenticeship, and the like, that we've done a less good job of in our country than some other countries have, is critical to helping people be employed. The third is that the best insurance against technological change is education. This is a lesson we see in lots of different ways, but in coming to deal with this disruption, it's pretty hard to predict what the jobs of the future will be. We have a really bad track record of that, but to date, every single time we've seen change, better educated workers have been better able to cope with that. And then finally, I don't think we can assume that even with steps 1, 2, and 3, that you wouldn't see a continued rise in inequality, that you wouldn't see continued challenges for some in finding jobs. So making sure that we have a safety net so that although the pie is growing, we can have everyone benefit from it is critical as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Appreciate it. I want to thank Karen and Leo and Brian and Jason. Each of your discussions were riveting and really held the room and raised awareness to the breadth of issues and ideas available to the laboratories of democracy, the states. Governors, this concludes our plenary session, and I'd ask you to join me for a private lunch in Salon 1. Thank you all very much.